Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Welcome back to Live from the Heartland for the week of February 20th, the year 2025. I'm still Michael James up here in Chicago's 49th Ward. And I got a notice not long ago from our friend Floyd Webb that he was going to bring a new film about Frantz Fanon to Chicago, and that led to us bringing not only Floyd, who is the founder of Blackness Network, that's NUSS, and Peter Hudis. Both of them have been on before. Peter is the author of Frantz Fanon, Philosopher of the Barricades, and teaches a course on Fanon at Oakton Community College. The initial reason to bring you on, Floyd, was because of this film. And why don't you tell us briefly about the new film about Fanon, where it's playing and when?
Okay, well, we're playing Thursday, February 26th at Logan Arts Center at University of Chicago campus. And the address I don't have in front of me. Oh, my God.
915 East 60th Street.
915 East 60th. Thank you. That's a real scholar.
And the doors open at 6:30. The film is at 7:10.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So this film, we haven't seen a feature film about people like Fanon. We get lots of documentaries. Matter of fact, we get like 2 documentaries a year about Fanon, but never a feature film. There's all of these people from that period. We got something about Shea. We don't have anything about Amilcar Cabral, And so it was really interesting to see that this had actually happened, And Jean-Claude Berny, who's just texting me now as I speak, is a young man who's done films like this. He's his first project the first project he worked on in Paris was Hate, Léon. You remember that? It took place in the Paris suburbs. Mm-hmm. It took place in the Paris suburbs, and it had to do with the immigrant community that had been placed out there, so that they basically live in these huge project blocks, and everything Fanon talks about would apply to that film and to that particular situation. The situation in the Paris suburbs is still like occupation, But this film takes place in 1953 when he goes to Algeria and works in an insane asylum. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about his experiences there, Mr. Hilton, about what he did in that insane asylum.
Yeah, thank you very much. Floyd, I really want to thank you endlessly for bringing this film to Chicago. It's a really amazing opportunity, and the work that you're doing with Blackness and with the film in particular is really outstanding. So thank you very much for your work on this. Mm-hmm. So Fanon comes to Algiers originally not for political reasons, right? Strictly political reasons. There wasn't the independence movement in Algeria hadn't quite taken off. There was a independence aspirations for many, many decades, but it took off about a year after he got there. So he comes in 1953 after initially wanting to extend his work in psychiatry, which he began in France. He went to practice psychiatry among Black people in Africa, okay? He was investigating the psychodynamics of racial oppression. And this is what really the subject of his first book, Black Skin, White Masks, is very much about. He wanted to originally go to Senegal, where they had a psychiatric hospital, but they didn't answer his application letters. So the next best place he thought was Lido-Jonville, outside of Algiers in Algeria, where they had a significant hospital. And then he went there in 1953, and he began to practice what's called sociotherapy, which is a series of practices he learned from a Spanish psychiatrist named François Tuqueles, who was a Marxist revolutionary activist and psychiatrist who tried to combine issues of practices of social liberation within the clinic, not treating patients as prisoners, not chaining them down, not treating them as subordinates, but trying to get prisoners to develop, psychiatric patients to develop a mind of their own through therapeutic practices that enhance their humanity. And Fanon came to Algiers to practice that sociotherapy techniques that he had already begun to practice in France with Tokelis in Algiers. And he transforms the institution, right? Alice Cherky, who was his assistant in Blida Jauneville, is still alive. I was at a conference in the West Bank in Bislett University last month where she gave a lengthy talk. She's 70 years later, still as live as ever, talking about her remembrances of working with him in the hospital, which is quite fascinating, the way that he carefully paid attention to the needs of particular patients and began to become increasingly aware of how he had to modify his psychiatric practices given the Muslim population and given the impact of colonial domination upon people in colonial Algeria that creates a very different need for different sorts of liberatory practices than he would practice in a place like France among the colonized. So he was devoted to practicing psychiatry among the colonized to help lift up their self-esteem and within the clinic itself.
Well, I did. You know what? While you guys are talking, I just remember the film, The Battle of Algiers, which is kind of talked about as being one of the greatest war movies ever made. That was about the time that he was in Algeria.
Yes, as a matter of fact, in November 1st, 1954 is when the National Liberation Front, the FLN, sparks an insurgency. And very shortly afterwards, Fanon gets into contact with them through a Pierre Chalet, who was a French radical activist who supported the national liberation struggles going on in Africa. And he becomes, in the next months, surreptitiously, secretly, because he would not have been able to maintain his job without it, becomes connected to the FLN and becomes a follower of one of the leading figures in the FLN. His mentor is Ramdani Abani, who is a radical socialist, a nationalist at the same time, who was one of the main leaders of the FLN. And that tendency of the FLN in WLUW 4, it was called, the section of the FLN, had argued for taking the revolutionary struggle into the cities, not extending it from the countryside into the cities in urban guerrilla warfare. And Fanon was instrumental in pushing for that move, along with Abani himself. And that Battle of Algiers, the film, documents what happened during the uprising that occurred through the activities and through the prompt of the FLN.
It's a hell of a film. I haven't seen it in a long time, but we used to show it to young kids in the neighborhood back in the Rising Up Angry days.
You know, when I talk to lately, when I mention Fanon to people, you know, it's interesting because they still kind of refer to him in the abstract as nostalgia, you know. But when we say that name, you know, people hear that, they hear nostalgia, they hear controversy, you know. But he was a psychiatrist. He was working in colonial Algeria in the 50s, treating victims of torture. And also talking to the officers who carried out. But he wasn't theorizing from a distance. He was observing how systems of domination operate, you know, not only through law, but through force and through the human nervous system, you know, how humiliation, fear, and hierarchy becomes normalized. You know, his book, Richard of the Earth, it wasn't a manifesto in the abstract. It was clinical notes on how colonial power, what colonial power does to like society's psyche. I mean, like, and for me, it was real relevant to show because of the rapture and the rupture that we're experiencing right now. You know, Black communities of color in this country have always experienced this kind of colonialism and fascism. We didn't name it that, but it was part of a process. You know. The colonial process and the capitalist process are like one and the same, just about the way that they extract from communities, the way we're like moved and like switched around. So it becomes urgent right now because his clarity about how power embeds itself so deeply. You know, the things he says, it's like common sense, you know. And he warned us that these systems don't disappear just because flags change. They reorganize, they adapt, they live on an institution, policing models, media narratives, and even how people see themselves. You know, revisiting Fanon today isn't about, you know, returning to the 60s. It's about asking whether we understand the architecture of the world we're living in and whether we're honest about how it shapes us.
Why is his work why does it continue to resonate so much today? It's getting a little bit connecting to why it's important for now. But he did talk about moving from national consciousness to social consciousness. Talk a little bit about some of that.
Okay, you're going to have to help me because I'm not the scholar here. I'm the person that's discovering this stuff based on the material conditions and objective reality that I'm living in now.
Well, that's why we brought Peter on.
Yeah, that's why we brought Peter on.
I wanted to let everyone know that in addition to the film, which is going to be shown on the 26th, I believe, also there will be a panel with Peter and someone else, and imagine you too, Floyd, following the showing of the film.
Yeah.
Well, I think that Floyd already, in a way, provided a good entrance to answering your question, Mike, because we are living through a period of intensified racist oppression. Racism has never gone away in America. There was never a point where there was a turning point away from it. But we're seeing a real descent into barbarism that's defining politics in this country. And Fanon comes alive every time there's a mass struggles that emerge against resurgent racism. We saw this in the Black Lives Matters protests of 26 million people coming out in the streets in 2020. One of the first experiences I had directly on this is when I was first asked to do the book on Fanon. I attended a rally. It was after the killing of Trayvon Martin, etc. And I show up at a small rally in Chicago, and there's 17-year-old, 18-year-old youth carrying a big banner saying, we revolt because we can no longer breathe, signed by a statement of Frantz Fanon on the banner. So young people were just coming into interest in Fanon to try to understand why they feel they could no longer breathe in America with police abuse, with unemployment, with economic opportunities being denied to them, etc. And the more racism has always been the Achilles heel of American civilization, and it shows itself once again and again and again. And Fanon keeps on coming back into the limelight in light of these conditions. The other thing that really has brought Fanon, makes him so relevant for today is obviously colonialism, imperialism, genocide, occupation. These are not historical issues. This is happening many places around the world, nowhere more so than in of course, the destruction of Gaza, the ethnic cleansing that's occurring in the West Bank by Israel, the genocide that is accompanying both. And there's a whole generation now is coming into political maturity, reading Fanon to understand why he focused in The Wretched of the Earth on the systematic violence that's embedded in colonialism, and why the violence of the revolutionary opposition is a reactive violence. It's not a violence of revenge. It's not a violence for the sake of violence. It's a response of necessity to conditions of total dehumanization, because colonialism is a system of total dehumanization. And I think nobody captures that more profoundly than Fanon in his works. And people recognize this. And so in light of what we're seeing in many different parts of the world, but especially in terms of Israel's genocide in Gaza and policies in the West Bank, but also in other places of the world, Fanon just seems to speak remarkably in a prescient way to the persistence of these problems within modern society.
Peter, let me follow that up with, we were talking before the show about your teaching The Wretched of the Earth and Fanon at Oakton Community College. And you had talked about young people in the streets. As a professor, a teacher of Fanon, what is the reaction of the kids in your class? And do some of them start off with knowing not much and then go a long way? Or do you get the most politically active, progressive types come into your class?
Well, I wish it was the second, but I get that at times. But yes, I teach. I made a decision to teach at a community college because I want to teach philosophy to working class kids who don't know that they're interested in philosophy and have no exposure to it. Because trying to get them to think critically and to look at issues that they may not get from other aspects of their education is a challenge. But that's what I think the beauty of teaching is. And what I find is, yes, most people come into the class having no idea who Fanon is. Some students come in with quite a bit of knowledge, though, by the way, because many of them have been touched by some of the issues I'm addressing, especially students from the Middle East and from Africa definitely know who Fanon is very often, although it's a minority of the students that I get. But nevertheless, what I find is that it's a mixed response. A lot of students stay quiet because discussing racism in America among many white people, let's face it, is something that puts them they don't know how to deal with that necessarily in the beginning, and they get defensive. But as we work through the text and we see what Fanon was, somebody who writes from his lived experience, as Floyd was mentioning, he's not somebody hovering in a helicopter looking down on the earth, right? He's writing always from his lived experience about what it was like to experience racism, what it was like to experience a 4-year-old kid in a subway, in a train car, who used the N-word against him, and the mother being embarrassed about it. Relates these kind of stories that it humanizes these kinds of issues for students. And I find quite remarkable work is done by many of them by the time we finish going through Fanon, in which they relate Fanon's ideas to feelings of oppression and alienation that they're experiencing. And many times it's people who have never suffered colonial occupation themselves, but they can identify with things happening around the world after reading Fanon.
Yeah. Floyd, I'd like to go back to you and get a little more about the film. The film was it was shown in France. You said there was some resistance to the film.
Yeah, it didn't get the wide. A film like that should have got a wide release. There was sort of a lukewarm reception to it. I mean, the French, for all the positive things, when it comes to dealing with their colonial past, they're very resistant. I mean, their colonial past hasn't really ended. They have a neo-colonial past. There's things that are going on right now in Africa where they've been thrown out of countries, but they're trying to maintain that extractive colonial presence. And they're pretty much still, successful at it. The film was. It did show it in Washington, D.C., and it showed, I think, in San Francisco. So we'll be the third place that it's showing in the United States now. So this is a Chicago premiere of the film.
Well, have you actually seen the film?
Yes, I have.
So you had talked to me a little bit about and both of you mentioned there's been documentaries about Fanon. This is the first feature film. Can you go into a little more depth about what is in the film?
Well, what's in the film is the experience that he has going into the mental institution and confronting these people and beginning to treat them like human beings, and the pushback he gets, because like my sister was a teacher and she had the same experience. My sister would take the worst students and turn them into the best students, but they had already been identified and already coded as the worst students, right? And no matter what they did, they were never seen. They were never allowed to advance in the eyes of the administration and the teachers. And this is the kind of thing he confronts there, Then he comes under surveillance, and he's it's I don't know how to explain everything that I've seen because I watched it one time and I don't want to give away a whole lot of the plot. You know what I mean? I don't want to give, I don't want to say what happens, but it's what happens in that sanitarium is very important. It's the thing that it's the basis of his book, Wretched of the Earth.
What kind of impact has he had on psychology and other people who practice it? I mean, is it taught in schools and universities here?
Oh, yes. He's had a big impact on what's called social psychology. And for a while, there was even he never associated himself with what was called the anti-psychiatric movement which is predominant in the late 60s and early 70s after his death, R.D. Laing and people like that. Although they drew from aspects of Fanon, sharp critique of the psychiatric establishment for having a blind spot on racism and also for not understanding the need to humanize the treatment of people who are suffering from mental illness. Fanon would do things like he would have his patients put out like a weekly newspaper. He would have them do film showings. He would have them circulate freely within the institution so they could have conversations with each other and get to learn greater social interaction. These were the kind of things that really were humanistic psychology. And this had a big impact on a lot of practices that people have adopted in the field in the decades since then. He's seen as kind of a trailblazer of that. He wasn't simply originating all this from himself. I mean, he learned a lot from Tokelis. He learned a lot from his patients. He learned a lot from the people he worked with, like Alice Cherky and his other assistants in Blido Joinville. And then he continued to practice psychiatry when he had to leave Algeria because there was threats to his life. And he practiced psychiatry also in Tunisia and Morocco. So he was a revolutionary all through this period. And he's living, not really separate lives because, as Floyd mentioned, he's treating guerrilla fighters secretly in the basement of the hospital, right? Both the medical problems they're having, but also the psychiatric stress and the psychological impact of colonial domination and the anxiety and the lack of self-esteem and all these other things that surround it. And so he was doing politics, he was doing philosophy, he was doing psychiatry, he was doing education in a way all at once. And it's amazing that he could accomplish so much in such a short amount of time.
Well, some things are popping up in my mind. And, back to Algeria, I'm not sure how it might relate to Fanon, but you did say he got kicked out of Algeria. Also, I remember there was a guy named Ben Bella who was the leader of the revolution, as I recall, and he disappeared. And it's not like Algeria has a real progressive government these days. Can you shed any insight on that, or
Yes, so the FLN was a liberation movement that had massive popular support among the Arabs and indigenous and Muslims and Berbers, Kabyles, that is, in Algeria against the French. But it was a group that had many different tendencies. There were some conservative tendencies, more pro-Islamicist, perhaps you could call it. There was also very radical tendencies. Abani, who I had mentioned, was kind of the leader of the more radical left-wing tendency within the FLN. And Ben Bella came from that wing as well. So Fanon dies just a few months before Algeria obtains its national independence, right? He doesn't get to see the victory that he helped pave the way for. Who takes over are people roughly on the left wing of the FLN who wanted to steer Algeria towards what he advocated in the last several chapters of The Wretched of the Earth, especially the chapter on the trials and tribulations of national consciousness, towards a democratic socialism, some kind of a socialistic transition from national revolution to a socialist transformation, an independent kind of democratic socialism. And there was problems with that from the beginning because the new leaders in Algeria didn't live up to all of what Fanon's values embodied in terms of aspiring for such a thing. But Ben Bella was definitely on the left wing of the spectrum who shared a lot of Fanon's concerns. He was overthrown in a coup in 1965, with the more conservative elements now took over. And he was placed under house arrest for like the next 20 years. And he was pretty much silenced, as were quite a number of other people who are colleagues of Fanon, were sidelined. His wife, I should mention, remained in Algeria to the end of her life. And she was an avid supporter of the Algerian Revolution. And she supported, continued to defend the Algeria against its enemies, of course, in France and elsewhere in the United States, etc. Tragically, she commits suicide in the 1990s in response to her disappointment at the civil war that broke out between the FIS, the right-wing Islamic fundamentalists, and the Algerian government that killed about 100,000 people which kind of ruined the hopes of the revolution that had so inspired so many people in the 1950s and up to 1962. But she was somebody who was a major figure in her own right that should be recognized.
I want to thank both Floyd Webb and Peter Hudis for coming on. I want to remind people that the film Fanon will be shown at the Logan Center for the Arts, 915 East 60th Street, Chicago. The doors open at 6:30. We're talking February 26th. That's next Thursday. And it'll be good to see you guys in person. Hopefully I'll make it all the way down there. And I want to